Hades is an amazing game. I feel like that's the perfect intro to a video about one of 2020's best games. Just get it right out of the way and say it. Hades is a phenomenal, exceptional, magnificent gaming experience from start to finish and back again several dozen times. This isn't a full on retrospective. Like my recently released Bloodborne video, which was over an hour long and went into an incredible amount of depth about the games From Software made before it, the perception of the game, and a whole bunch of other details. Instead, this is going to be a much shorter essay about one very specific aspect of Hades. On top of doing retrospectives of whatever older games I've decided I want to play, and weekly podcasts about newer games and games news and culture, the other type of video I really want to bring forward into 2021 are the shorter ish essays that I would write that were usually reactions to something I've been playing for a review or an upcoming game, or just something that ends up being on my mind in general. Videos like the weird experience I had with the first few hours of Other Side, or gushing about the ping system from Apex Legends, or the time that South Park The Fractured But Whole, of all things, was a key part in my accepting that I was trans. So, in the spirit of the Words About Games mission statement for 2021 about making less content that we're more passionate about, I'm going to keep doing these types of video essays. Also, side note, there's been air raid sirens going off all morning around where I live. So if you hear an air raid siren in the background of the video, don't worry about it. It's fine. Probably. Maybe. So I want to start in 2021 talking about Hades, specifically God Mod. I've got Hades on my massive pile of games to make a retrospective for at some point in the future, but as part of a much larger video talking about all of Supergiant's games leading up to it, Bastion, Transistor, and Pyre. But God Mode in Hades is such genius game design that I really wanted to talk about it, and coming off the back of my Bloodborne retrospective, where I discuss difficulty and challenge a lot, feels like a good time to actually sit down and make this video. First, some context. Hades is an isometric action RPG that's also a roguelike. You play as Zagreus, the son of Hades, who's desperately trying to escape the underworld to find his mother on the surface. You're aided by your estranged family, the pantheon of Greek gods, and face difficult odds fighting against damned souls and a few recognisable figures from Greek mythology. Eventually, you'll die, because that's how roguelikes work, and end up right back where you started. Normally, in more traditional roguelikes, this means resetting to almost zero. You awaken at the beginning of the game a little wiser to the dangers that lay ahead of you, and probably with some sort of currency to spend on upgrades or some new weapons or abilities unlocked, something like that. There'll always be something to mark some sort of progress through the game, but essentially, you start again from scratch and have to fight your way back through the game to hopefully get a little further than you did last time. Some games handle this die and reset gameplay loop incredibly well, such as Dead Cells or Rogue Legacy. Some, not so well. Hades, in my opinion, is the best at it. Ever. Of all time. Supergiant puts on a masterclass in roguelike game design by tying the progression of its story into this repeated cycle of death and rebirth. It does everything else. Sure, you collect currencies you can spend on upgrading Zagreus' abilities, unlocking new weapons, constructing new rooms in the underworld, and the dungeons you'll be fighting through. The usual stuff you'd expect to find in a roguelike to give you the feeling that you're constantly making small amounts of progress, even when you die horror. But Hades puts its story front and centre to the entire experience. I'd expect nothing less from Supergiant, a studio that's created 3 games with 3 really strong narratives leading up to Hades. In fact, heading into Hades and knowing it would be a roguelike had me a little worried that the game would be less focused on its writing, which was generally one of the strongest parts of all of their previous games. I needn't have been worried, as it turns out, because Supergiant expertly tied its incredible story and characters into the structure of the traditional roguelike. Not only does Hades tell a brilliant story, but in having that story progress after you meet a terrible fate somewhere in the underworld completely removes the sting of dying. Death in Hades doesn't mean starting from scratch with maybe enough currency to slightly upgrade the player character a little. It also means getting to advance the game's overarching narrative, as well as talk to some of the characters in the underworld and advance their individual storylines. I could pontificate at length about the excellence of the narrative in Hades, or its superb gore gameplay, or its tremendous cast of characters, or any number of other aspects of the game. and I plan to do exactly that in a future retrospective video, so keep an eye out for that. For now, however, I feel like I've set the scene enough to discuss the topic of this video, God Mode. Hades is a pretty tough game. It kinda has to be. If it was easy for players to guide Zagreus out of the underworld, then the entire structure of the narrative would completely fall apart. Advancing the narrative and character arcs would be next to impossible if the player wasn't, dying. And so it's pretty tough to actually fight your way through the game's four worlds and past its final boss. But therein lies a problem all on its own. If the game is too difficult, eventually players would hit a wall where the story wasn't progressing. There's a pretty significant and noticeable difficulty spike when you reach Hades' third dungeon, for example. If a player gets stuck at any part of the game and keeps dying over and over without making progress, then eventually the narrative is going to stall out. While this might not be a problem for everyone who plays the game, it could definitely impact some players who would otherwise really enjoy the story, but could theoretically get stuck and frustrated by the game's core difficulty. Difficulty is subjective, after all. What's easy to me might be really challenging to you, and vice versa. This presented Supergiant with an incredibly difficult tightrope to walk. Make the game too hard, and you risk alienating players who would otherwise fall deeply in love with the world, narrative, and characters, but who maybe aren't so great at roguelikes or isometric action games. But if you put an easy mode into the game, those same players might then stop dying and thus miss large portions of the story because escaping the underworld was too easy. The solution Supergiant came up with was fucking genius. Like, seriously, there's clever, and then there's what Supergiant did to make sure anyone who wanted to enjoy Hades could enjoy Hades. Players who struggle with the level of difficulty in Hades for whatever reason can turn on God Mode. Despite what the name implies, this isn't necessarily an easy mode that allows players who use it to pile drive through the game with ease. It's actually way more subtle and way smarter than that. Anyone who finds themselves getting stuck, struggling to make it past certain sections of the game, or just generally isn't all that great at this type of game but wants to keep progressing the story, and why wouldn't you, it's amazing, can activate this mode at any time. God Mode changes exactly one thing about the game. It doesn't make Zagreus more powerful or weaken the enemies that stand in his way. Instead, it increases Zagreus' damage reduction by 2% every time he dies, to a maximum of 80%. It literally doesn't alter any other part of the gameplay. Enemy damage, enemy health, boss fights, boons, Zagreus' abilities and damage output, everything else stays the same. But when you die, revive in the underworld, and head back out for another shot at freedom, you'll be just that little bit tougher. I'm going to say this again because I can't gush enough about how brilliant an idea this is. This is game design genius. By having God Mode increase the player's damage reduction in small increments that build up over time, it keeps the narrative structure of the game intact. Activating God Mode won't give players an immediate boost through the game. They're still going to die a whole bunch, respawn at the beginning, and progress the narrative. But the more you die, the tougher you get, which means that even if you're abjectly terrible at isometric action games, you'll still eventually be able to power your way through the game's many challenges and get closer and closer to the surface. God Mode allows players who need it the ability to experience all of the amazing narrative and character arcs. It manages to both keep the game's death and rebirth loop intact, thus preserving the game's unique narrative structure, and allow players to eventually successfully escape the underworld and see the game through to the end. God Mode adapts the game's difficulty to whoever's playing. Whenever I've turned the game's difficulty down so I can experience its story, I've generally found that a quote-unquote easy mode makes the game far too simple, for me personally. There are a few games that handle this really well with what I like to call modular difficulty, a myriad of different options, sliders, and toggles that let you tailor the difficulty to what suits you best. For an example of this, we can look to Celeste, which has an assist mode, which is an example of this done really well. You can turn all of its many sliders up and blast around its maps like Supergirl with infinite stamina, invincibility, and an infinite number of jumps if you want. Or you can make slight tweaks to give yourself just enough of an advantage to survive, or make up for an aspect of that game's platforming that's tough for you specifically. It basically allows you to tailor the game's difficulty to your playstyle and skill level. Whether you need a little help or not, you can essentially create your own difficulty, and you can have whatever experience you want in Celeste. Hades couldn't really implement a system like that without potentially destroying its narrative structure. If you could make Zagreus an all-powerful, unstoppable, indestructible juggernaut, you'd miss out on most of the game's story. Instead, Supergiant found a way to create a similar system, but one that fit the game that it was trying to make. One player might be completely fine with Hades' level of challenge and never even think to turn on God Mode. A second player might need just a little bit of a boost to start making it through the game. A third player might need all the help they can get. The beauty of God Mode's existence is that all three players can have the exact same experience of Hades. And that truly, and I'm going to say it again, is genius game design. Like, I've often argued in favour of an easy mode for games like Bloodborne and Dark Souls. In fact, I even had a small section about that in my Bloodborne video. I know people who would be really into the worlds and lore of those games, but who are put off by the level of challenge those games present. And it's a damn shame that they'll probably never get to experience them. But for all my arguing that those games having an easy mode would be a good thing, I have wondered how one could realistically be implemented. Turning the difficulty down like a traditional easy mode would allow more people to experience the world of Yharnam, but potentially at the cost of the stellar core gameplay Bloodborne has to offer. Hades is the answer. If a game like Bloodborne had a system like God Mode, it would not only allow more players to jump into the game and experience it, but the adaptive difficulty that tailors the challenge to each player's individual skill level would allow all of us to have roughly the same experience. And it wouldn't be an issue for players like me, who like Bloodborne though it is, because I just wouldn't turn it on. That was my wrist cracking in the middle of the take. Ow. Oh, I can just imagine the possibilities. I really do hope someone at From Software played Hades and had a similar train of thought. I'll be honest, that's what prompted me to make this video. After finishing Bloodborne and putting together the retrospective, I decided to jump back into Hades to finish it and unlock the true ending. And the idea for this video more or less arrived fully formed in my head after a couple of runs. Hades told one of the most compelling stories of 2020, packed with some of the best characters. Whether you're a fan of roguelikes or not, I promise you that this is a game worth playing. If you don't believe me, head on over to the game's Steam page. There are currently over 100,000 player reviews for the game, which are 98% positive, and a lot of these reviewers say the same thing, that they're not usually into roguelikes, but Hades is an exception. Thanks to the inclusion of God Mode wrapped around an incredibly well-told and well-written story, Hades manages to be a roguelike for everyone.